Hello, welcome back. It's me, Xpsupernova, and today I'm doing a challenge run with my friend Saj. Now, this world, as you saw in the title, is actually just entirely made of Hellstone, with a couple of exceptions, mostly just being house blocks and cracked dungeon bricks, which I'll get into later why that wasn't actually replaced. It was at first an accident, but it actually turned out it made the challenge possible in the first place. Now, there are two major issues with Hellstone, as you might know. For one, it causes the burning debuff whenever you touch it, killing you very quickly early on, all things considered. And two, you can't mine it. Now, for the second issue, you might think that I could just go kill an evil boss, which actually would not be all that terrible, even with bad gear. But there is one issue with that. There is no way to obtain bottles this early on, or break Crimson Hearts this early on. Not to mention, we actually can't even make a furnace in the first place, so yeah. We are going to be dealing with a world we cannot touch and cannot mine for a majority of the playthrough in Pre-Hardmode, so that's pretty lovely, isn't it? Now, me and Saj's first priority was actually to end up making ourselves a house, as the merchant would allow us to get rope, which is our first renewable way to get across the world. Surprisingly, even with all these trees, they're actually not renewable for a long while in the challenge, unfortunately. And thankfully, due to a random pinky spawn, money was actually not an issue, thankfully enough, so that's pretty nice. The merchant also gives us access to an anvil, but to be honest, an anvil doesn't really help us in our current situation all that much. And to be honest, 5 iron or lead bars really do not save a lot of time in the grand scheme of things, as we are going to be doing an ungodly amount of fishing to get any sort of gear or preparation done for bosses coming up ahead. However, before me and Saj would start some fishing, we decided to both explore the world. I decided to head to the left side as the dungeon was actually on that specific side of the world, and the reason I knew that was because of P-Edit, which I used a couple times in this challenge to find specific structures. Mostly just the dungeon and shimmer, as they would have otherwise been a lot more annoying to find, unfortunately. Using rope to traverse the world is very tedious, and I end up falling off the rope quite a few times, and so does Saj as well. But eventually, after exploring for so long, I finally find a big water pond and decide to go fishing anyways, because I kinda got tired of just using rope and going to the left side very slowly. Just for the reference, it took me 30 minutes to get to this water pond, and it's not even that far from spawn, unfortunately, so we had a long journey ahead of ourselves. Also, it just so happens that worms actually do not spawn on Hellstone, so you might be wondering how I actually obtained worms in the first place. Well, I just so happened to obtain them from those random rocks that you often see on the surface, and they just so happen to drop worms occasionally, so with a bug net and a lot of dying, I eventually got enough worms to do a little bit of fishing here as well. On another note, it's actually pretty awful to explore caves early on, as touching even so much as the corner of a piece of Hellstone will set you on fire. So you have to be very careful when navigating them, and it's often not worth it, especially in this world, where most of the caves just actually did not even reach the underground layer, unfortunately. Anyways, back to the topic of exploration. Wood is also ironically a limited resource in this world for a long while, so I try to be sparing with using wood, usually only using it in caves and the such, as rope would really not work in tight spaces such as these. Money itself is also quite the issue, sadly enough, as their only real source of it is fishing. And even with all the rocks on the surface that can spawn worms, we still don't really have that good of a source of bait, as, again, touching the surface in any capacity burns you to death and kills you extremely fast. So our only real option to get bait for fishing is either to die a bunch of times and slowly grab ourselves some worms, or fish in order to get some ores for worms to finally be able to spawn on during rainstorms. So yeah, our money is quite limited early on. Also, for the singular person wondering if graveyards are a viable source of bait, they aren't, because for whatever ungodly reason, maggot zombies are incredibly rare, and as mentioned before, maggots will just not spawn naturally on Hellstone, for the same reasons as worms, sadly enough. So yeah, bait is still limited even with graveyards, which I find kinda funny, because graveyards end up still being one of the most useless biomes in the entire game. Anyways, on a random side note, while I was exploring the surface trying to get to the dungeon, I found this.
Oh! Oh my god! Yo! That's actually insane. We got the slime staff. Let's go!
Anyways, after a couple of hours of traversing the surface to get my way over to the dungeon, I finally made it there. The primary reason I headed over to the dungeon so early on was actually to get myself some better weapons, as our current weapons are not exactly good enough to kill any sort of bosses really, besides maybe the Eye of Cthulhu. Once I had entered the dungeon, however, I realized that I didn't actually replace cracked dungeon bricks with Hellstone, and I opted to not do that for reasons you'll see later, because otherwise, again, as I said before, the challenge would be literally impossible. Also, a fun fact about cracked dungeon bricks is the fact that the dungeon guardian will not spawn at all if there's just cracked dungeon bricks in a dungeon. Yet it still does count as a dungeon biome, funnily enough, so that's kind of cool, I suppose. While I was in the dungeon, I ended up finding a cobalt shield, which is very useful as I don't actually want to have any sort of knockback on me, because getting knocked into the Hellstone can kill you pretty quickly, and an aqua scepter, a kind of mediocre weapon. Though I guess it is technically better than a wooden bow, so you know, we take what we can get. In case you were wondering how I got the 2 golden keys to open these chests, I actually just needed to break some pots, and I found a chest at the surface that also gave me a golden key. I also ended up finding an alchemy table and a bewitching table as well, and the alchemy table actually is kind of useful as it allows us to craft vicious powder to summon the brain of Cthulhu. Except, wait a minute, there's one little tiny issue with that. You see, the problem with fighting the Brain of Cthulhu is, well, we can't actually make a Crimson biome right now. We still have 0 access to dirt, so we can't exactly plant Crimson seeds anywhere, even if we were to kill the Eye of Cthulhu, sadly. Anyways, once dungeon exploration was concluded, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go do some fishing for some ores and some accessories, and while I was fishing, I actually ended up getting Hermes boots, and pretty early too. Unfortunately, Hermes boots don't really help us explore the surface that much, even though they do make you run quite fast, as we can't stand on the surface for any meaningful amount of time before we die, unfortunately. Not to mention, the burning debuff also has the unique effect of slowing you down if you touch it, weirdly enough. I also ended up fishing a Reaver Shark, which is funny because it used to be able to mine Hellstone in 1.3, but was nerfed in 1.4 to not be able to mine Hellstone at all, unfortunately. Though it is kind of funny I ended up fishing it up in this playthrough. Though with the ungodly amount of fishing me and Sag ended up doing in this playthrough, it was bound to happen anyways. Most of this time at this point is spent fishing for ores so I could start setting up a worm farm underground, or looking at the surface for loot so I could actually get myself better prepared, or get myself some extra worms for fishing. But otherwise, progress was quite slow at the moment. I also ended up going to a Crimson biome to try to break a Crimson Heart, but that ended up failing because I forgot to bring myself a stick of dynamite, unfortunately. I also ended up going to the dungeon as well, and I ended up getting myself a handgun, which is probably one of the best weapons we could have gotten here, thankfully enough. In order to take a break from fishing and exploration, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go fight the Eye of Cthulhu. And it just so happens that he actually was a bit of a challenge, ironically enough. It turns out that having 120 HP and barely any armor on Master Mode really makes a huge difference, even on early bosses like the Eye. Our situation is also not helped by the fact that Hellstone literally chunks half of our HP near instantly if we touch it, so yeah, we have to be quite careful when fighting the Eye. It also would have helped if I actually lit up my arena so I could see where I was going. But otherwise, yeah, it really wasn't all that difficult, but it was more challenging than I was expecting. The only real useful item that I ended up getting from the Eye of Cthulhu was actually the Shield of Cthulhu, as we can't actually smelt any of the ores that we have, and for now, the Crimson Seeds really aren't able to be used, as again, as I said before, we don't have any dirt blocks to place them on, unfortunately. After defeating the Eye of Cthulhu, I decided to set up a worm farm, like I mentioned around a minute ago. All you really need to do to make the worm farm is just set up some underground housing. In this case, I decided to place it in the Crimson, since that's one of the only places in my world that actually has access to the underground for some ungodly reason. And to place some ore down for the worms to spawn on, because as I said to the millionth time, worms do not spawn on Hellstone at all unless you break rocks and the such on the surface. And for a quick rundown on how this farm works, all it really relies on is there being rain and NPCs to replace enemy spawns with critter spawns, and that's essentially it. And to my knowledge, apparently ores have a higher chance to spawn gold worms, though I don't really know if this is true or not, to be honest. Unfortunately, from this point forward, the only real way we can get any sort of major progress done is by doing a lot of fishing. As a matter of fact, 90% of the time from this point forward is either spent getting bait for fishing or just fishing itself. So yeah, we spent a lot of time on it. Now there's actually 2 primary things that I wanted to get from fishing. One was accessories, which we still have a good set of right now, but I still needed to get more. And B, heart crystals, because I needed to get myself the Goblin Tinkerer at some point. At first, me and Sag conserved bait for Blood Moons, as bait was kind of scarce early on. And it also helps that Blood Moon enemies drop some pretty useful stuff. Mostly just the Vampire Frog Staff, which is the main thing we were looking for, though we also got the other drops as well, eventually. Once we were stacked up on bait, however, I decided to go fishing in a normal pond. And while I was fishing there, I found something that would be incredibly useful for the run. An Obsidian Skin Potion. Even with all the infrastructure set up around the world, it's still incredibly useful to have an Obsidian Skin Potion, as it allows us to explore some much more narrow caves than we normally would be able to at this point in the game. And in fact, I used it to explore the Desert Cave, and it just so happens that antlions actually don't need sand to be spawned in. They just end up spawning behind naturally generated sandstone walls, thankfully enough. And the reason sand is so useful is because we can actually spawn the angler with it at the ocean, because the angler only spawns on sand for whatever reason. And having the angler is incredibly useful since it allows us to get ourselves some much better fishing upgrades, as currently we're just using a reinforced fishing pole to fish up stuff, which is not very good to be honest. Though we are subject to fishing quest RNG as of now, since we can't fish in most biomes in the game at the moment. Sand also unlocks our ability to make a desert biome, though we'd need to get ourselves a sand gun and some ammo reservation potions in order to actually make one in the first place. Which wouldn't exactly be happening for a while, as we need to get topaz for that. I also ended up making a golf farming setup on a random side note, and never ended up using the golf cart, funnily enough. I also ended up making a sky bridge across this entire world, and for whatever reason, I chose to make this world a large world. And it would have been much better if I would have just made it a small or medium world, as I actually could have gotten to the underground in the first place. But yeah, the sky bridge is very long, and the only reason I was able to build it was because I found dynasty wood from the traveling merchant. I also ended up building a little fishing pier because I was getting tired at looking at just Hellstone and water for the entire time while I was fishing. A slime rain also ended up popping up out of nowhere, but it really wasn't all that much of an issue, and I ended up defeating King Slime first try because, well, he's King Slime, and I had gotten more HP by this point in the game. Anyways, sometime after defeating King Slime, I ended up getting enough heart crystals to get to 200 HP, which would allow me to fight the Goblin Army. However, I wanted to wait for Sag so that way he could join in on the Goblin Army as well. So in the meantime, I ended up doing some more fishing and actually got myself some more obsidian skin potions. And with the obsidian skin potions, I ended up going to explore the underground jungle a tiny bit, since that was the one cave that actually did make it sort of deep into the world. And luckily enough, I ended up finding a fiberglass fishing pole in a random tree, so that's pretty awesome. And after completing some fishing quests from the angler, I actually ended up getting myself a golden bug net, funnily enough. Unfortunately, Sag ended up being busy for longer than I expected, so I decided I might as well eat the heart crystal and play some other games for a while so I didn't get burnt out on Terraria itself. Anyways, once my friend was finally not busy anymore, I decided to finally give them the gear that I had fished up, because I had a lot of extra spare gear that they were able to use to power themselves up as well. And then we ended up fighting the Goblin Army, and it was pretty much a complete joke for the most part, thankfully enough. Then we were off to go find the Goblin Tinkerer, and one time he actually spawned outside the dungeon, so we tried to do some hoik shenanigans to get to him, but neither of us actually know how to hoik through walls that are more than one block thick, so we didn't really get any progress done, funnily enough. Though I did eventually find the Goblin Tinkerer in the dungeon and was finally able to combine all of my excess accessories that I had. Anyways, after finding the Goblin Tinkerer, me and Sag decided we would get ourselves even more prepared than we already were. At this point, me and Sag decided we were going to get ourselves as prepared as possible in Pre-Hard mode to see how far we could actually take the Hellstone world in terms of progression. You might also notice the fact that we're in a jungle biome, and it just so happens that a little grass cup sprites happen to count towards the jungle biome, thankfully enough. And thankfully, due to a 1.4.4 change, we'd be able to get ourselves jungle grass anyways by just using corrupt seeds on mud and then using purification powder on it, so that's always kind of cool. Once me and Sag were finally prepared, however, we decided to finally go fight Skeletron, and the only real issue with this fight, surprisingly enough, once we had our mobility and gear set up, was just kind of getting out of the starting area. Though thankfully, Skeletron was not that hard, as I said before, and we beat him pretty much first try once we were actually prepared, ignoring the other test attempts. And thanks to an obsidian skin potion me and Sag fished up earlier, it wasn't actually all that hard to go down into the dungeon and get ourselves the mechanic. And all we really need to do is place down a couple of dungeon bricks crafted from dungeon walls, and we actually got her. And the reason we didn't need to place more is because cracked dungeon bricks count for a dungeon again, but they just don't spawn anything on them for some odd reason. Now, the primary reason the mechanic is actually so useful in the first place is because she finally allows us to get through the world with actuators, which allows us to get access to both the shimmer and the underworld, along with lava as well. Which is ironic, because normally Hellstone is very well known for dropping lava all over the place, but that's actually only in the underworld, thankfully, which does make our life easier when we are finally able to mine through Hellstone. Now, once I finally had access to actuators, I decided it would be a good idea to actually go down and get myself some lava in the desert, since the desert edges have lava around them for some odd reason. However, I realized after going a decent bit down that I'd actually need myself a furnace anyways to get myself an obsidian skull, so I went back up to the surface and headed over to get to the shimmer instead, which still took quite a while. The one neat piece of tech I'd like to mention here is the fact that I can actually use an inner tube to float above the Hellstone, so I wouldn't actually have to touch it at all, and I would be able to actually mine through the world without dying a bunch, so that's awesome. Now, the main reason the shimmer is so valuable to us in the first place is because it gives us access to both dirt and stone, and access to more wood as well, as Dynasty wood can be shimmered into regular wood, and oddly enough, Dynasty wood can't be used in every single wood recipe for some odd reason. And the reason stone is so important is because, well, it finally allows us to get ourselves a furnace, which is incredibly useful here. And the reason dirt is so useful is because it finally allows us to fight the Brand of Cthulhu for a Deathbringer pickaxe later on, and also allows us to make a jungle, which is... Anyways, with access to a furnace finally, I decided to go back down into the desert to get myself some lava for an obsidian skull. And with access to an obsidian skull finally, it was so much easier to end up exploring our world and actually heading to the underworld later on, as it is actually extremely painful to have to deal with the burning debuff constantly while trying to explore. My next priority after getting an obsidian skull was actually to go get myself a Deathbringer pickaxe so I'd finally be able to mine all the Hellstone around our world and be able to craft it into tools and armor and the such. And thankfully the Brand of Cthulhu was pretty much a joke as I was over-prepared with dungeon weapons and whatnot, even with less HP than I normally would have at this point in the game. Now that I finally had a Deathbringer pickaxe, I'd finally be able to get to the underworld and fight the Wall of Flesh if I really wanted to. But, as I said before, I decided I wanted to get as prepared as possible in Pre-Hardmode before I fought the wall, because I thought it would be fun. And that was kind of a mistake as the grind I ended up doing was extraordinarily long, but I'll kind of cut it into this short little nice montage. We ended up grabbing ourselves a Hellforge, doing some lava fishing in an underworld to get ourselves a bottomless lava bucket, making ourselves an artificial jungle so that way we could have access to a blade of grass, the last little piece of the puzzle for the Night's Edge, duping sand with an ammo reservation potion in order to make ourselves a desert, then placing the blocks that we needed to make said desert, and making a little nice fishing pier at it, so that way we'd be able to fish for a sandstorm in a bottle later. Making a gem corn farm so that way we'd have access to more stone and diamonds, and later amber potions for crate potions. Crafting Terra Spark boots for the accessory roll compression, which is very nice. And last, and certainly most painful, fishing for not one, but 2 sandstorms in a bottle, because me and Sag both needed one. Why is it a 1 in 30 chance to get these from Oasis crates? Biome crates are rare enough as is, and it was very painful to get them. I'm talking it took around 6 hours of fishing just to get 2 of them. It was bad. And with that all set up, we were finally fully prepared to fight the Wall of Flesh with probably the most over-prepared setup I've ever had in Terraria, and that's honestly kind of funny. And well, take a look for yourself on how quickly the wall was melted.
Oh, that dodge was clutch. Run! The wall is not hitting me, what the fuck? Holy crap! He's already dead! Wait? The wall is already dead? What? I took nothing and he melted. That was a joke, Sag. Holy fuck, we way over.
Power of magic.
Yes, the power of magic, man.
And with Pre-Hardmode concluded, that marks the end of the video. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like or maybe even subscribing, or joining my Discord down in the description below. And I want to give a special thanks to Sag for actually helping with the video challenge in the first place, because otherwise it would have been a whole lot worse to go through, so thank you very much, Sag. Apologies for the poor audio in this video, by the way. My microphone is currently broken and I need to get myself a new one, so I had to use my headphones for this one. But otherwise, that's about it from me, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Goodbye!